Okay. Right. We are gathered together as a group to work together on a book. It's a short book, but it's sort of a kind of unified theory book that goes everywhere. Its title is God's Image, Neuroscience and Theology. And on this first slide, I give the outline, its table of contents. And now I'm going to try to advance the slide. Right. At Mount Sinai, I did get to St. Catherine's Monastery, but they didn't allow us in because it was the festival of the Dodogi Apostoli, the 12 apostles. But this is the earliest depiction of Christ. It's a Byzantine icon done in wax, encaustic, which is the same style as were the portraits on the Egyptian mummies, the classical Egyptian Roman mummies. For instance, the copy that I always use on Terence's comedies for the figure of Terence, who was an ex-black slave. And here we see Christ Jesus in the place actually also of Moses on Sinai, although this has come from Constantinople. And he's holding the book, which is analogous to Moses with the law. And in the other hand, he is blessing us. One side of his face is judgmental, and the other is merciful. And the same occurs with the Byzantine mosaic at Cefalu, commissioned by King Roger II, the Norman king of Sicily, who was multicultural with Arabs, with Jews, and so forth. Again, you get the judgmental side of the face and the merciful side of the face. And the same is true of our own faces, because of our bicameral minds. I was friends at Princeton with Julian Jaynes, and we spent many, many hours in the annex discussing this book before he published it. Also with my father's friend, Thomas Day, who was a brilliant Greek scholar who had studied under W.B. Stanford of Trinity at Dublin, who spoke of Greek poetry as sung. The pitch marks, the accents are actually pitch marks, and so forth. And that is the trait of the right hemisphere, which is poetry. The left hemisphere is prose. The ambulance going by is going to the hospital of Folco Portinari, the father of Beatrice Portinari of Dante's Vita Nuova. Apologies about the noise. Julian, before the modern science of neuroscience, which wasn't possible until they were able to electronically study the brain in the lab, sort of, so to speak, he was studying literary texts to see how in earlier texts, in pre-literate cultures, for instance, Homer, when persons were under stress, they externalize the stress. For instance, Odysseus externalizes Athena, telling him how to solve a problem. She's a hallucination of his right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is much more hallucinatory than is the left, which is logical and linear. And then also I watched this TED talk by Jill Bolt Taylor. She had a severe hemorrhage in her left hemisphere. And she woke up one morning with a sense that she was completely in touch with the entire cosmos. Everything was so beautiful, the colors, the sounds, and so forth. But when she tried to get help, she couldn't even function with the numbers and letters and the name of her colleague trying to reach him on the telephone. She did eventually manage to speak, but it was so garbled that he understood something was wrong, and he immediately sent an ambulance. They got her to the hospital. They operated on her brain. She was paralyzed for a while and recovered. And now she speaks about the importance of the right hemisphere, the extraordinary experience she had. And also at a conference, I met Marshall McLuhan's son, Eric, in Rome, and he sent me the PDF of Ian McGilchrist's wonderful book called The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World.
Carol, we're meeting.
Yes. And in this book, he's explaining that we are going too far into the tyranny.
I'll tell her in just a minute.
Of the left brain, which is the danger for our culture. If you could mute yourself, Michael, while you talk on the telephone, that could help.
Julie, I was just talking to Carol. She can't get in. Can you let her in?
Okay. Let me see if she can click on the code I sent her in the email.
Can you click on the link that you sent her in the email?
She should be able to get in.
She doesn't, you don't have a link, Carol? Oh, it's the wrong link.
Okay, tell her to go to the latest email and click on that.
Go to the latest email and click on that
link. In The Master and His Emissary, Ian McGilchrist speaks about the danger to Western civilization because we are becoming too left hemisphered. And he also says wonderful things about first-person narratives, as in Dante's Commedia, creating much more activity in the brain than does the detached observer, the omniscient observer, in that form of a novel. Recently, I've caused a bit of a stir by suggesting that some of the manuscripts I've been editing of Brunetto Latino could actually be in Dante Alighieri's hand when he's his student. And this is in the Times of London, and this is in the Repubblica. But one of these manuscripts, which is possibly in Dante's hand, has this splendid image of the square and the circle.
Yes, you need to click on the one for one.
Which will end up being Dante's vision of God at the end of the Commedia. Now, the circle is the right hemisphere.
Bye-bye.
The square is a kind of man-made construction. It's not really natural. It's a cheap form of constructing things. And it's angular. And as Brunetto points out, it is not really as efficient as the circle. The circle actually holds more volume. It is the shape of the cosmos, the sun, the earth, the egg with the yolk, the wine barrel, and so forth. And early constructions tended to be circles like Stonehenge. Native Americans tell me they hate square houses. And I've lived in a teepee, and the feeling is splendid of being in contact with the entire cosmos.
Hello?
Brunetto also describes how if you drop a stone through a hole through the earth, it will get stuck at the center, which is what Dante's Satan does.
I'll try to tell her.
And this
She's kind of lecturing, so
a drawing in the manuscript, possibly by Dante, of that stone stuck at the center. And this is
Julia,
before.
Very quickly, Carol still is trying to get on, and she doesn't have the link.
There are other people present, so if you go on talking to Carol with your microphone muted while you do so, because this is being recorded, and then I will admit her when she clicks on the link. In this discussion, we realized that Dante and Brunetto were talking about gravity long before Newton. and the apple
Okay,
dropping,
bye-bye.
the round apple on his round head. Also, Brunetto designs this exquisite cosmos with the angels, the principalities and thrones and so forth and powers. And he includes amongst those ranks Homo, man. This is 2 centuries before the Renaissance. This form of the right brain inclusion of man is very much not just the individual that we have today with the left brain, but this sense of man being in the contact with everything, with the cosmos. And then we have Leonardo da Vinci's drawing, the same of the circle and the center. Now I want to talk about libraries. The British Library, as it was, with the beautiful Panizzi dome, its sense of the roundness. And this is where, but in its manuscript room, I read Julian, Brunetto, Dante, and so forth, and then was able to create further books and editions from their writings, multiplying them as we do our wild irises, Florence's lily. And here again is another image of the room. Let's see, we now have 6 participants. Have I admitted them all? Right, okay. Carol is with us, I think. Carol, can you say you are with us? Right, okay. Yes, okay. Let's see, how do I admit her?
Yeah, Julia, she's still trying to get on. She doesn't have the link.
Right, invite her. Okay. I think if she... Carol, if you click, okay, now I can do it. Right, here you are. Right, okay. Now we're talking about the British Library and how it is circular, which is of the right brain. And then, unfortunately, okay, let's... I'm shutting up your dog, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry too.
That's all
Susan,
right, I can do it there. And also, what happens next is that the British decide to rebuild the British Library. And what they come up with is no longer the gorgeous circle, but something that's absolutely muddled and chaotic, like Brexit. I forgave it when I saw how they wrote the British Library, because it rather matches the opening of the Amherst manuscript by Julian. And then I also read the Julian manuscript in the Paris Bibliothèque Nationale Library. And here again, it was circular. And you would enter one hemisphere and stay in that hemisphere all day, or the other and stay in that other hemisphere all day. It's shaped like the human brain. Someone mentioned Virginia Woolf saying being in the British Library reading room was like being in the brain of a giant. But this is what the French did, the logical French. They built 2 square glass towers, which was ruining the books. They had to carefully cover up all the glass windows. That is the left brain. It's not the right brain. And then we have our own library in Florence's English Cemetery, founded by our association, which is called the Aureo Anello Association, from the motto on the wall of Casa Guidi that Elizabeth Barrett Browning made of her poetry, a golden ring between Italy and England. And I also wanted to talk about the importance of libraries for women. We were excluded from education. But if we had access to a good library like Christine de Pizan, who as a child was given by the King of France. She was a little Italian girl who showed up at the court. She was given the run of the King's Library with all of its manuscripts of the classics of Dante, Brunetto, Boccaccio, and so forth. And when she was left widowed, she took to writing beautiful books which she illuminated. And her first one was of rewriting a feminist Dante's Commedia, where she is taking the role of Dante in blue, and the Sibyl takes the role of Virgil, and she is in red. And the young and the old women, we will come again later with Luca della Robbia's sculpture of the Visitation. This chapter, the second chapter, the first one had dealt with men, with the image of God and the image of the man. But also I had early written, edited a volume of essays called Equally in God's Image, which got me into trouble sometimes in the churches, the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church. But in this book, we were pointing out that in medieval culture, initially, women had status. Christianity was the religion of women and slaves. Jesus's ministry was very much right brain about inclusion. The Samaritan, the leper, the Syrophoenician woman, the outsiders, he ingathered them. The elderly woman with osteoporosis who couldn't climb up to the woman's gallery in the synagogue. He dragged her right into the midst of the men, which is something that people seem not to have noticed. But in this chapter, I wanted to talk about that and how this book, which then saw the shape of the Madonna changing with the Crusades and the adoption of the Greco-Arabic universities in which only theology was allowed to be taught and from which women were excluded. That meant that from the 12th century on, Christianity lost its way. The Madonna became simpering towards her child, who is now her superior, then no longer equal. But this was the Byzantine Madonna, and she is actually modeled on Helena, who possibly was the British slave in York, who was Constance's mistress and the mother of Constantine. When Constance dies, Constantine makes his mother empress of the Roman Empire. And she is the one who possibly converts him to the religion of women and slaves. And so we see, and this is my own painting, the Madonna often with the baby, both of them in Roman togas. It's a kind of palimpsesting of Mary and Jesus with Helena and Constantine. And then we have the beautiful Chartres, La Belle Verrière in stained glass. And now we come to Julian of Norwich, whose spiritual director was possibly Adam Easton. They were both possibly Jewish converts in Norwich. 96 Jews did convert to Catholicism in medieval Norwich. And they were extremely learned, their community, with several great scholars and so forth. And Adam Easton owns the writings of Rabbi David Kimhi, who speaks about God as both male and female. The Shekinah is female. So it became natural for Julian to also make God be genderless. I, it am, she says, and so forth. And then I wanted to talk about how women managed to come back into education and learning by writing governess novels. Madame de Staël and so forth, writing novels about doing the grand tour of Europe, which was meant to be for men, for their education. The women took that on. The Brontes were writing novels. They were also writing novels about social issues, about going back to women and slaves, to the outsiders, to bringing them into being included with Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw, Michael Armstrong, Factory Boy by Francis Trollope, who's buried here. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point, and Aurora Leigh, where the heroine, one of the two heroines, is Roma, and so forth. And also, what I found fascinating when I went to the conference on St. Birgitta, held by John Paul II, was then Cardinal Ratzinger speaking about the theology that's written by women is revealed theology. The academic theology written by men is not. And we even know, for instance, of Thomas Aquinas teaching away at the Sorbonne in the Street of the Straw, of having, in a sense, his own stroke of insight and saying it's all nothing but straw. All of his logical Aristotelianism describing, defining God is nonsense. And he takes instead to writing gorgeous, right brain theological poetry. Now we shall discuss Boethius, who was the Roman consul who was accused unjustly of conspiring against Theodoric, cast into prison, awaiting execution in the most horrible form, where they would bind cords around his head until his eyes dropped out, and then finished off with the bludgeon and the axe. Before that, he had already written wonderful books on mathematics and music and so forth. And I had found one of the manuscripts in the Biblioteca Capitolare in Verona, all color coded on ratios and harmonies. It was absolutely exquisite. But he, under pressure, now writes A Consolation of Philosophy, where he's moaning and groaning and writing love sonnets about how he's so badly treated by Lady Luck, and he's all tied with chains to the halls of the theatre. When Lady Philosophy enters, she's sort of the hallucination like Athena to Odysseus and so forth. And she says, "Begone, you hussies." She throws him out, and she laughs at Boethius and she says, "Look, you're lamenting the loss of your beautiful ivory and crystal bookcases, but you remember all the books you read." And then she tells him about the circle and the center, how at the center is God, is freedom, is beauty, is everything that is good, is being. And that as you disperse yourself further and further away from the center, you go into evil and sin, which is actually non-being. It's an extraordinary description. It's not our polarity. And then they took to building these windows in churches based on Boethius' idea, often with Lady Luck, Lady Fortune on the outside, with the king being crowned and then falling, and which is black and grey and ugly, whereas inside it's gorgeous. Now, if you take Boethius and Cusanus talking about we as the other, God as the not other, as everything that is, we can see that even in Dante's Commedia, all of the characters he meets in the Inferno each have a bit of that of God in them. Julian says that all that God has created has God's word in them will be saved. It's an extraordinary, daring, heretical statement to make. But Julian gets into the Catholic catechism and so forth. And she is what Ratzinger says is revealed theology. But here you have the outside, which is war, the sexual abuse of children by clergy, everything that's wrong. But if you turn it the right way around, instead of it being inside out, it will become everything that is good. It will be love, not sex, and so forth. And this goes back to the combining of the left and the right hemisphere, which need to be in harmony with each other, the circle and the square. And then this is for Michael. These are his trees in the manuscript of the Rhetorica by Brunetta Latino. And I've specially put it in for Michael. And then to talk about Fibonacci, the golden ratios of the Nautilus square shell, the beautiful support for the figure of Aurora in the Medici tombs by Michelangelo, which go on to being the Baroque and then also Liberty architecture. Nature's mathematics is all about curves. This is Lord Leighton's lily, which we have now planted all over our cemetery. This is Cardinal Bessarione, the fresco in his house. And here is the real one, not my painted version. And also fractals, this new form of mathematics, where we can see everything about ourselves and the cosmos. All of us are fractals. Even our literature is fractals of mixtures of documentaries and fictions and so on and so forth. The left brain wants to say it's either or, and it cannot be both and. The right brain says it's both and that's what Dante's Commedia is. And so I now wanted to go on to William Morris and John Ruskin. William Morris with his gorgeous descriptions of flowers and so on, the curves. And John Ruskin, who has the Companions of the Guild of St. George, it still continues, and I'm one of them, where he was rebelling against the ugliness of machine-made machinery, square boxes, plastic, metal, and so forth, and arguing for handcrafts and so on. And I've gone backwards. Now I feel it's really crucial to have a chapter, this chapter 4, on trauma, because that is the outside of the circle where things have gone terribly wrong. And this fresco of the life of St. Augustine in San Gimignano shows you the schoolboy Augustine, his Christian mother Monica, his pagan father, and the schoolmaster who seems decent, who comes to get him, to bring him to the school. And then we get this scene of violence. He hasn't learned his Latin very well, so his buttocks are bared, he's on the shoulders of another student, and the master whips him, beats him. And then you see the same child, and Augustine's always talking about children. Now the child is at the master's side, and he's smirking at his older, innocent self. He's joined the ranks. And it's Augustine, not in Orthodox theology, but in Catholic theology, that we have the doctrine of original sin. It's not, he also talks about sin as being non-being. He contradicts himself. He has a terrible fight with the British Pelagians, disagreeing with Pelagian's theology, which is very similar to Julian of Norwich's. And I think the bane of original sin has done a great deal of harm. This is original sin. This is Guernica. You see the horror of the newspapers, the black and white. This is the left brain. This is the bombing of civilians in the Spanish Civil War. And you see the mother screaming over the dead child, and it's the slaughter of the innocents. Also, though, you have in Siena, and I went with Michael to Siena to find the document in Brunetta's hand. Here we have good and bad government. The city at peace, prosperous, the allegorical figures of justice and peace and so forth. And then on the other wall, everything is wrong. The tyrant is ruling. This is Trump. Avaritia, vainglory, cruelty, deceit, fraud, and so forth. And you see justice shrouded, being buried alive. And now I wanted to show instead the opposite. This is Luca della Robbia, who takes a story out of the Gospel of Luke of Mary coming to Elizabeth. Mary is the unwed mother, the teenage mother. She's got herself into trouble. She comes to her cousin, who's of the priestly caste, and both of them are pregnant. And they're smiling at each other. They're laughing. She is proclaiming the Magnificat about the world upside down, where the hungry shall be fed and the rich shall be sent empty away. This is true justice. And also, the elderly Elizabeth laughing because she is pregnant reminds us of the Silenus box in Socrates that is discussed in Plato's Symposium, of the old pregnant ladies laughing and so on. Now, chapter 5, the abolitionists in our cemetery. And this is where, again, you have a whole group of people, men and women, and even a black slave, buried together, who were working to bring about true justice, to bring about the right hemisphere of inclusion instead of exclusion. This is our cemetery as it was. It was originally a square by the city gate. This is what it looked like in 1868, and all of those tombs but one are still there. Then Podgy turned it into the oval, and this is where the library is, which I delight in because it is like the brain. And then we have the painting by Arnold Berkelin of the Island of the Dead, because he buried his baby daughter here, about which Rachmaninoff composes the music. Now, Frances Trollope wrote Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw. She had traveled up. First, I wanted to talk about Dennis Looney, who showed up here asking to see these tombs because he was writing a book on the Dante scholars, the Black Dante scholars, the African Americans' response to Dante as a poem of liberation. And he told me that Frances Trollope and Hiram Powers had together created in waxworks Dante's Comedy. All of this is very right brain at the frontier in Cincinnati. And Frances had traveled, she's the mother of Anthony, had traveled up the Mississippi and seen slavery firsthand before Queen Victoria was on the throne, and hated it. So she wrote a splendid novel against it, which is also a documentary. This scene shown by her children's tutor, Auguste Evo, who was traveling with them. They witnessed together of the slave boy being kicked, and the money is lost that his master has given him to buy tobacco, so he will be beaten again when he goes home. And now we need to go to the next slide. This is Richard Hildreth, who also wrote a slave novel the same year that Frances Trollope did. And in it is a scene of the separation of the children from the parents, which is also was going on at the American border to Mexico. And then those two novels, both Hildreth and Trollope, are buried here, but not Harriet Beecher Stowe. But she copied their novels to create Uncle Tom's Cabin, which changed so much. This is Hiram Powers, who sculpted the Greek slave, which was the very center of the Crystal Palace exhibition. He's American, and he did these three works: the Greek slave, the last of her tribe, he's part Native American, and America. I think she's more beautiful than the Statue of Liberty. But she's trampling on slave chains, and Congress before the Civil War rejected that sculpture. And then Elizabeth Barrett Browning saw Hiram Powers' Greek slave. She came from a family of slave owners in Jamaica. She was herself part Black, and she wrote this powerful sonnet against slavery in both America and in Europe. And we will talk more about the European side of slavery. She writes Aurora Lee, which I edited for Penguin, and you can see her Creole features. She's not an English blue-eyed, blonde-haired lady. And then Champollion Rossellini in 1828 went on an expedition to Egypt and Nubia. And Rossellini's uncle bought the freedom of Nadezhda. She was originally called Kalina. She was a black Nubian slave who came to Florence at 14. She dies in her 40s, 30s, and she's buried in this beautiful tomb of marble in the only Greek Orthodox cross that the Swiss, who are Protestant and iconoclastic, allowed. And then we also have, we don't quite have them in our cemetery, Mary Somerville buries her husband here. She had no education except finding a book of algebra. She discovered two planets. She taught, she wrote textbooks which were used at the University of Cambridge, and she taught Ada Lovelace, Lord Byron's daughter, mathematics. And Ada then, with Charles Babbage, invented the computer. And so we owe a great deal to these ladies, and no one teaches about this. They might talk about Turing instead, who is later. All three of these ladies, in their beautiful portraits, died following childbirth because the men didn't know to wash their hands when delivering babies. Sarah McAlmont, Louise Kunis-Lecomte, that's her self-portrait, and Fanny Holman Hunt, that is Holman Hunt's portrait of his wife. And Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith in the Victorian period sought to improve housing for the poor with sunlight and fresh air against diseases like tuberculosis. And we help Roma families, especially where there is tuberculosis, with windows, repaired roofs, and so forth. Dr. Bartolomeo Ottocini, he was the doctor for Anita Garibaldi and her children in Uruguay, and then also for Garibaldi after the Battle of Maspromonte. And Frederick Douglass came here 11th of May 1887 to honor the tombs of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Theodore Parker, and Richard Hildreth. This is Theodore Parker, who preached against slavery in Boston with a loaded gun at the pulpit. And this is Frederick Douglass's handwriting. Slaves were not allowed to learn how to read or write. And this is his travel diary, which is in the Library of Congress. And from slavery in America, we also have it in Europe for the Roma in Romania. This is a slave village in Romania in the 1850s, and it's like the same villages that they have today. Karen Graffio, she and I went to Romania together, and we also went into the camps in Florence, so I could help her with speaking Italian to them. And this is Poderaccio in Florence with the baby in the cradle. She was copying how ancestors were in James Agee and Walker Evans, Now Let Us Praise Famous Men. Karen took this photograph of a family, a Roma family, living on a garbage dump, a rubbish dump in Cluj in Romania. But look how clean everything is. The tub for washing the baby, the beautiful tablecloth and the flowers, the dignity in the midst of the squalor is amazing. And then these are my Roma. This is Margarita who began the planting of our irises. She has the most beautiful eyes, and she was working to pay for her son to be trained to be a builder. And this is Vandana. She told me that they were 12 to 1 room with no windows in Romania. And I went and checked. I didn't believe it. It was true. Here they've built 5 rooms for 7 people. 2 of them are couples. It's better than what they had in Romania. And let's see, this is our next final chapter is on the Roma. I found, after starting our alphabet school, that in Romania in the 19th century, schools were held in the cemeteries, but only for the boys and not for the slaves, not for the girls. This was the cemetery when I came, put to weed killer, very left brain. The tombs vandalized, a lot of, it was terrible. There were syringes everywhere. This is what the Roma did. They completely transformed it. And it became so beautiful, everyone collaborating. But they told me the story, not only of their slavery from the Middle Ages to the 19th century, but then under the Nazis, they were transported to Transnistria by social assistance, which is why they're terrified of social assistance, and left to starve in open fields to the extent that they even, in some cases, ate the newborn out of hunger. When I heard this story, I asked the Orthodox Romanian priest to come and do the ceremony, because what they felt so awful about was there had been no funeral for their dead. No bread, no wine, no candle, no coffin, no grave, no priest, and no banquet. So we did all of that here in the cemetery and named all of the names of their dead, whom they all remembered despite being illiterate. This is my first Roma baby. This is 20 years ago. She'd already had one baby, and I'd made a cradle for other one because my husband did not allow me to have cradles for my own children. And she had the baby and then was in an abandoned warehouse, and the police threw them out on the day of torrential downpour of San Lorenzo. And her husband telephoned me, and I went with the umbrella and I said, Hedra, you're coming to stay with me. She said, I can't, the baby's not baptized. She was afraid something terrible would happen if it was in the cemetery before it was baptized. And we walked past the Duomo, and I thought to myself, shall we go in the Duomo and ask a priest to baptize him? And I knew he wouldn't. So, knowing my canon law that even a pagan like Virgil can baptize a Christian like Dante, I said, Hedra, I will baptize this baby tonight. And we did, and they stayed with us. And it was paradise. The baby never cried. She would sing lullabies to it of Alleluia. And they repaired, cleaned the house from top to bottom, repaired all the dry walls. We helped them with their documents to get the baby safely out of the country back to the grandparents in Romania. And we did the same for this baby, where social assistants wanted to put it up for adoption. This is the baby in the hospital, and this is the baby after we got it back, persuading the judge to release him at 4 months old to his parents. Stefano, who's gorgeous. And this is Daniel and Vandana, whom you'd already seen outside the shack. They're building the cradle for their baby, which would be born the next day because the police forced her into Carabinieri into their car. They're now back again living with me. And Daniel, first year, he restored all of the ironwork. And then Lord Guth paid for his apprenticeship to Alberto Casciani, a top restorer, to restore the tomb of Sarah Elizabeth Guth. And then they're restoring the tomb of Edward Porteous, who was at the Battle of Waterloo. And he's working with Nicolai Offray. Their collaboration is wonderful because they read each other's minds. They read mine. They do everything I need done before I've even asked or even thought it needed being done. Here is Daniel with Alberto Casciani with the booklet from UNESCO. The UNESCO asked me to take 2 photographs of restoration work in Florence. And they had cleaned this entire statue with laser. Daniel said it would have been better done by hand, and the electric bill was enormous. And here is Daniel making the facsimile with Enrico Giannini, who was my bookbinding teacher, of the book in which Dante is condemned to exile and death. And this is the pulpit of Donatello in Prato, which Daniel helped restore. And this is our library school. At first, it was only the men who came, and I was very worried. How could we get the women to come, knowing that if women are educated, our life expectancy increases and infant mortality decreases. Finally, the men explained that the Roma women are very chaste and they won't allow themselves to be in the same room with men who are not their husbands. So we put the men outdoors under the trestle, on a trestle table under the arch, and we went up to 19 participants with the women and children. This is Zoita. She's a widow, illiterate. She's looking at a children's book of Dante saying, Che bello. And her children, this is Esmeralda, she's 10 years old, and Fernando is 12, with two New York University students. Esmeralda had come to my computer screen where I was transcribing Brunetto Latino, translating Aristotle's Ethics on Justice. And she read it in her third language perfectly at 10 years old. Then the Comune threw them out of Florence because they were begging on the streets after being bulldozed out of their camp. Then in my Anglican convent in Sussex, I was tutor to a Methodist ordinand, mother of 5 daughters. And I asked Hebe and her twin sister to come to Florence to teach the Roma how to chisel inscriptions in marble, which they did excellently. This is Mihai and Daniel and Hebe and her sister. And this is Marianne, Nikolai Ovray's daughter, chiseling Catherine McKinnon, the name of the Tsar's governess, who herself came from the great poverty of the Scottish island of Mull to Russia, then to Florence. And we get help from the Agatha Esmeralda project to provide library schools and a stipend for 10 mothers and a widow to stay with their children in Romania instead of leaving them with grandmothers there and returning here to beg for their family's sustenance. And Mihai Coppola made it possible for 40 Roma to find housing, a library of books, and a place outside of Florence, which had these people had for 8 years lived under the loggia in Innocenti. I had been begging everyone, the Comune, Caritas, Monte Domini, no one would help them get housing. The Roma managed to do it themselves. And I pay him 100 a month to clean this Renaissance floor where the inscription under the stair is using the same words from the Latin Vulgate as is used for the floor with precious stones of Solomon's temple. Florence is a kind of New Jerusalem, but before that floor was left filthy, unbelievably dirty, until I and the Roma cleaned it. Now we keep it clean. Now the story, the last daughter. This is this is Diamanta and Yonel. All 4 of their children were taken from them by a ruse by a socialist system that makes a lot of money out of them. 1,300 a month for each child, and the Roma, being illiterate and despised by everyone, have no power in the law courts, despite the Italian law courts saying the law is equal for everyone. It's not. They've only been allowed to see their children officially twice in 7 years. And you can see the sadness in Diamanta's face. She's been grieving about this loss ever since it happened 7 years ago. And here I am recording her telling her oral tales. This one about a king and his 3 daughters, and Shakespeare's Lear is a fractal of this, which she hopes her 4 children can find on the web. And now for our conclusion, and then we can talk. This was the cemetery, and this is how it became. This is the rose window, and this is what it's like on the outside. But even all of the beauty of this rose window is somewhat mechanical, repetitious, a little bit of the left as well as the right. And then we have this, the lilies of the field. Consider the lilies, how they grow. They toil not, they spin not, and yet I say unto you, that Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. And this, I think, is Merton's concept of the sign of Jonah. The sign of Jonah is that of God in everyone, which is good Quaker theology. So I think we can go from the mathematical circle center to valuing this gorgeous blue marble we have. And now I'm going to interrupt the sharing, and we have all of us are here. There's Michael, there's Carol, there's Nancy, there's Bernard de la Santina, and there's Alex. So now it's time for everyone to chime in. Who wants to speak first? Unmute yourselves. Unmute your microphones. Please. Okay, shall I try to do it for you? Right. Okay. Except for, I'm even going to unmute Barney. Right. No, he won't unmute. Okay. He's being like an auditor. Did it make sense?
Thank you, Julia. It was wonderful, as usual. I have a question for you.
Yes.
You mentioned Marshall McLuhan,
Yes.
and you know that he influenced Father Walter Ong tremendously.
Yes. Right.
And so my Ong lens clicked in, and I was thinking
Yes,
about this in Ongian terms.
yes.
And what do you think? What could you comment briefly on literacy and orality, how it plays through all of this, the two minds? And
I'm not following that. I've got Walter Ong in the paper version of this, because it's Walter Ong who writes the wonderful essay in Speculum on Aquinas's poetry.
Mhm.
And I took, the visiting professor was Etienne Gilson at the University of California at Berkeley, who was teaching Aquinas, and especially teaching about how Aquinas gave it all up and said it's all nothing but straw. He'd been doing all of this Aristotelian analysis and realized it didn't work, and went to writing this gorgeous liturgical right brain poetry. So I've used Gilson and on that.
Interesting.
And so many of the aspects of this book have come from lectures I've heard. The Rose Window, that was John Lyall's lecture at Princeton, which got plagiarized by Donald Howard and so forth. But it's kind of like reaping a harvest, a communal act for the common good, which is also what Foucault was saying in his lecture he gave at Boulder on paresia, the importance of saying the truth for the common good, for which you should not be punished. And I.F. Stone lectured at Princeton on the trial of Socrates. He taught himself Greek in his 80s. And he said, what's wrong in Plato about Socrates is that they do not use the word eleutheria, freedom. They hate freedom. They love Sparta. The Republic, that's a kind of Orwellian term, because the Republic is a monarchy based on the lie of the metals, that the slaves are iron, the nobles are silver, and the king is gold. And this is not true. It's convenient. So I have this quarrel with Plato, but then I went and read the Laws, which I thought was going to be awful, and it's all about play. And I studied the symposium for an entire semester in Greek under Harula Evgen, who's a very beautiful Greek scholar and underwater archaeologist off the Greek islands and so on. And she was a wonderful teacher. And if you read Plato's Symposium from the viewpoint of women in Diotima, Philosophia, Mary, Athena, and so forth, it just changes it. It makes it more real, more human. And this is why I feel it's so important what we were calling our project From Graves to Cradles is to, in a sense, undo death, undo harm, to especially working with. I filed an awful lot of papers with the Independent Inquiry of Child Sexual Abuse in London on what I was seeing in England and Scotland. I think it's terribly important to use paresia to speak out, but also to say that the perpetrators must be given space in which they can tell when it was done to them to undo the vicious cycle. And that's why we started doing this project of blessed olive leaves in times of trauma. I feel we have to, if we're going to talk about God's image, we've got to talk about evil as well. And to see the two as kind of, this is another a brilliant book in Italian and Romanian. It's by Horia Roman Patapievici on the eyes of Beatrice, where he sees that final vision of the cosmos of the rose, which is very often illustrated as a tiny little drawing at the top of Dante's Cosmos, isn't tiny. It's that entire cosmos, but the other way around. And the way Gottfried von Strasbourg says that when Isolde lies, that she's lain in no man's arms save that and the pilgrim who was Tristan in disguise. The law of Christ is turned inside out like a sleeve. You need to turn it back around again. And this is why women making their own clothes, which I do, you have to constantly sort of figure out how to do things on the right side and then turn it around on the wrong side to get the seam redone in order for it not to undo, and so on and so forth. You have to play these conversion games, and it takes quite a lot of intelligence to do that. You can always mute your dog when you want to.
I'm sorry, Julia.
But it's
She's
fine.
quite unruly.
Carol, if you want to say something, because Carol and Michael and I gave the talk on the abolitionists in the cemetery in Little Rock. And I went to the museum in Little Rock of the participants, the girls who went to school, facing all of that violence and hatred with such courage. This is where you get the Magnificat world, the women and children. If Christianity can go back to being the religion of women and slaves, and Dante the text for women and children, we might get it right. Carol, do you want to chime in on that? Unmute yourself.
Well, I have a dog, so I wanted to mute myself because he occasionally erupts. But we were talking before about the experience of going through that museum in Little Rock, how it really brings to the fore all of the emotions, and you feel that deep respect for people who were able to actually, and these were children. You're breaking through this wall. They now, I don't know if you saw it, they've got a sculpture of all of those young students up at the Capitol. There he goes. Which I think is a
Yes.
Hold on, I'm going to let him out.
And it was interesting because you also showed me the Clinton Library, which was built with such expense, and it just left one cold. Whereas that little garage gas station was so powerful, sort of a 1950s architecture opposite the school. That this is the world. The right way round is the world upside down. We're dealing with paradoxes, which is there in the gospel. It's such a revolutionary text. The church has turned it inside out. It's the wrong way around now. But I think if we can
Yes.
unravel what's gone wrong and get back to the core of it, perhaps we've got a chance if we can listen to the children. I used to find that children's stories had so much more wisdom than ours do. Alex.
Julia, well, in some ways, this is the second time I've heard you did a more slender version of this.
Yes.
2 weeks ago, was it?
Yes.
And you and I have been on Zoom and talked. I think this was an I mean, I'm sitting here just very quiet because I'm so moved by what you've created, which is its own kind of cosmology, except that you have only you could have put this together, I think. And that's what's kind of thrilling, is to see the kind of connections that you may think are very obvious, but they only become obvious once you have presented them.
Well, you were the one who showed me that the cemetery before and after and the rose window were alike. I hadn't noticed that.
So when you were doing that a couple of weeks ago, it was left hand brain, right hand brain,
Yeah.
and it, it was just sort of stunning. I think that, what you've created is something so rich and like a feast. And what I particularly like towards the end, the feast becomes like a Seder, and we have bitter herbs,
Yes.
we have an egg, we have, and I love the fact that you actually ground this in the living,
right,
in the cemetery.
In a cemetery.
And I know, as you know, I've known very well a mother and daughter at the Innocente, and so to watch what you're doing, and I think the photographs, certainly of the women, of all of them, but in the women in the library, but also of, and I'm sorry, I forget her name, who's chiseling the marble.
That's Marianne, yes.
It's an extraordinary photograph. Yes. Actually, people changing their own inner cosmology, if you will.
Yes.
So I think that there is, anyway, I'm just very grateful for this. I don't know how you could do anything but have this let people access this on the web. And as you know, I'm hoping that we could do a slightly slenderer version of this for people who do not have references. They don't know, they may not even know who Plato is. But anyway, I think what you've created here is magnificent.
Yes.
Well, it's thanks to the support that you have given me, because I know I'm sort of breaking a lot of rules.
Oh, thank God.
If I had actually joined a monastic congregation again, I would not be allowed to work with the Roma. I mean, these are in Europe. This is the largest, poorest minority. They are the untouchables. And what amazed me was to find they're so much better than we are. Their morality, their cleanliness, they are the opposite of what we think they are. That we have projected onto them our own filth, in a sense, which is what I think happened also with slavery in America. I loved the experience of traveling on Greyhound buses. When I was in America, I knew you never travel on a Greyhound bus if you were a respectable person. That was only for the down and outers. And then I was a nun, and I didn't have the money to visit my children, who were in Tennessee and Colorado, and Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. So I was traveling on the Greyhound buses, and the wonderful people on the Greyhound buses. Their family ties, they were Native Americans, they were Hispanics, penitentes, they were Blacks, they were gorgeous people. And I was saying to myself, these are the people we need governing America. Then I'd be in the airports, and it would be with the whites, and they were all afraid of each other, cold and stiff and so on and so forth. I much prefer being on the Greyhound bus to being on a plane. And I had to undo all my preconceptions on that. And I think we haven't realized that the treasure is at the bottom. It doesn't trickle down. We've got to let it trickle up.
Right.
Julia, I remember
Gotta bubble up.
ago that you were at the Badia, I think was the Badia,
Yeah.
where you have the Mass for the poor. And some woman, a Florentine, said to you, "Oh, these people, who are these people?" And you said, "This is a Mass for the poor," you know?
Right. This was a wonderful mayor of Florence, Giorgio Lapira, who went out and gathered up all of the derelicts from under the bridges and so forth and brought them to the Badia every Sunday to Mass and gave them a bit of money and blessed bread and listened to their problems and had them tell him how to govern Florence. And it's still going on. Giorgio Lapira died a long time ago. I stumbled on it per caso, by accident, but Julian says nothing is by chance or accident. And I was looking for the Jerusalem community, which I'd known in Paris. And instead, it was the Mass for the Poor. And there was Fioretta Mazze, who was a very noble Roman lady, Florentine lady. And I was in rags. I was so poor. And I was too ashamed to accept the money when I went out the door. I mean, I was really at the bottom. And she invited me to lunch, and because she saw I was a stranger. And she invited me that afternoon to the Amicizia Ebraico Cristiana, the Jewish Christian fellowship group in the garden. And she kept asking me to come and see her. I was Anglican and she was Catholic. But she was dying, and she was desperately worried about Florence. And I said, all I can think of that I could do to help would be if I could find space for a library. And after she died of leukemia, the Swiss asked me if I would look after the cemetery. And I said, yes, if I can have the library. And that got written into the contract. The library I'm in control of. And it has really worked well.
Is it the library that's my background?
That's right. You've got an you plagiarized my library.
I pilfered her library.
It's lovely. I want you to send me that picture so I can use it too, if you don't mind my plagiarizing it.
I'll be glad to.
A palimpsested library. Palimpsested library.
I think we should all have that image, and that would just be wonderful.
Yes, it's got Pico della Mirandola on the plate and
Well,
so forth.
I'll send it to you, Julia, and you can send it to anyone else who wants it.
Great, yes.
Right.
Yes. Now,
Oh,
Nancy, could you unmute and also and talk? Nancy?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mhm.
Now,
Okay. I was kind of anxious just before the Zoom started. So I had gotten ready to take a walk, and I'm walking in the park, and we have these little free libraries. Have you heard of them?
yes.
Let's see if I can show you. Doesn't really show up.
No,
Oh, well.
I'm seeing the map of Europe instead. But the free libraries, there was a wonderful thing which I did have on my PowerPoint and then took it off, where somebody wrote a letter to a free library saying that he'd had a stroke and he was learning to walk, and he would come to this library and was reading the books, and he wanted to thank the person who'd made the free library because it had helped his rehabilitation.
That's really neat.
So even if you have a stroke and so forth, there's hope. And what I loved one day was someone coming with a beautiful engraving he had done, which had also put gold leaf, of the raising of Lazarus. And he gave it to the cemetery. He said, I've had a stroke and I did this painting because of that experience. And it's hanging up in the rooms and this is what I love, because there's a sense of creativity that happens here. Artists come and so on. It has a kind of well, it's a holy experiment that the Quakers would call it.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I keep feeling it's sort of like the kingdom of God, here and now in our midst. You don't need to look for it up in the
yeah,
heavens.
exactly.
It's
Mhm.
here and now. But it happens where you're not centered on yourself, but on the others.
Yeah.
And the communication also, I feel so important, that deaf children and mothers learn to sign much more quickly than hearing children and mothers learn to speak. It's so important with the baby and the mother smiling to each other, the mirroring that goes on, that sort of nurtures the child's soul, the image of God in the child through the mother.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if the child lacks that, the children in care of that Diamanta have
Mhm.
now lost their characters. They sort of become left brain and angry.
Yeah.
But if the nurturing happens, you're not going to have school shooters, for instance.
Yes.
I think
Right.
a lot of the horror of what happened at Congress with the Trump supporters, those were people whose childhoods had been stunted,
Mhm.
had not had a sufficient affection, were in a state of rage about not having been cared for,
Yeah.
and
But
therefore rejecting anything that's. So
what I also wanted to ask you is, have you seen? There's an article in the New York Times. I can send it to you if you're interested. It's about there's an exhibit of a number of Titian's paintings in Boston at the Gardner Museum.
at which
And
museum?
the Gardner Museum, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston.
Yes, Alex took me there. It's a wonderful museum. I love it.
Yeah, well, this
It's a
exhibit.
museum done right. I can't
Yeah.
bear the modern museums with the white walls. That's left brain stuff, where
Yeah,
they take
yeah.
everything out of context. And I've actually resigned from being counselor of the Museo Casa di Dante because they've done it so terribly now.
Oh no.
They went all electronic without any background. You remember how we used to say garbage in and garbage out with computers?
Yeah.
You really need to have a great deal of learning to use these instruments to their best effect, not just using it for the sake of itself. It doesn't work that way.
The exhibit is on Titian and women, myth, and power.
Women, I need help with this because of my hearing loss.
Women, Titian, the artist, the painter who painted all these paintings illustrating Ovid and like the Rape of Europa and all these.
Alex, can you hear what she's saying and repeat it to me?
It's an exhibit in Boston at the Gardner Museum.
Yes.
It's Titian, and it's mythological, his mythological, as opposed to the kind of Doja portraits.
Right.
And it's about women and power. And Nancy, I could certainly send you the link.
That would be fascinating. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Gardner now has done exquisite exhibits that in the new part of the Gardner, there on the upstairs, the second floor, there is quite a small space which they've concentrated. They've had a beautiful Frangelico, they've had a beautiful illuminated books, they've had things. And so this Titian is kind of this exquisite exhibit that's just on.
Yeah. But the article is so interesting because it's discussing, what do we do with these beautiful pieces of art that are all about violence toward women?
Right.
I thought, Julia, your thing that you had to say, about Augustine and his conception of, or the initial original sin, and then going right to the slide of Guernica, I thought, and you said this is the original sin. That's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. I love that moment too.
To me, original sin is Cain and Abel.
Well,
And
and it's,
remember that Cain was not executed. He was to wander the earth as a pilgrim with the mark of Cain on his brow, which was copied in medieval pilgrimages because they didn't believe in capital punishment. We talked about Piazza Beccaria here. The Tuscany and Russia ended capital punishment back in the 18th century as cruel and inhumane. And I think the Quaker principles of being against war, against capital punishment and so forth are all based on the concept of that of God in everyone. And even if we're atheists, if we treat the other as if we are in the presence of God, then there can be healing. Even a pagan can baptize a Christian and so forth. It's this extraordinary, these paradoxes that if only the left brain can't accept them, the right brain delights in them. So I think we need to learn how to dovetail the two together better. Our education is all wrong. It's now STEM. It's completely gone against anything of the right brain, and that just is to treat the children as if they're growing up little Spartans, as cannon fodder, as slave keepers, and so forth. It's without love. Without Dante and Julian both speak of the importance of love and end their texts with that. And I think that's the way we should end this tonight. And thank you so much.
thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Julia. It
you.
Thank you.
was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Oh, are you going to send a copy to us?
Right, I will post it and